Hello students and welcome back to our Analyzing English video series. In this video we're going to go through an article that I think relates to our use in American English of the word like. A filler word that can be used in various types of expressions or various parts of a sentence, but we're going to go through this New York Times article published on February 15, 2024. I'm recording this a week or two later, but I want to go through this article by John McWhorter from the New York Times. It's an opinion article, so it's just his perspective, but I want to dive into his thoughts on why we use like so much in the English language. Specifically, I found in American English, compared to other dialects, we tend to use like when we're having trouble thinking of the exact word or when we're trying to connect the sentence together. But the title of this article that we're going to dive into and we're going to analyze is, where did our strange use of like come from? So we're going to dive in. My name is Ben with English from A to Z, and let's get started. So we have the photo here to start with: like, low, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, high. So some people turn the like meter up. So we know in English, I like, you like, we like. We like the food. You like the show, I like the person, etc. But there are multiple uses of like that this article is gonna talk about. And I do like this image here because sometimes certain people use like more than others, right? So we're gonna talk about the word like by this opinion writer at the New York Times, John McWhorter. And basically, I'm going to read through the article. I hope you'll follow along with me. I won't make this video too long, but I'll stop and make comments here and there on my thoughts on this part of the English language, focusing on like. So the article starts with, some months ago, one of my readers sent me an invaluable cache of recordings of family members during therapy sessions in the 1960s. They are ordinary, seemingly educated white Northeasterners ranging from their late 20s to late middle age, speaking casually. And what stands out today, 60 years later, is how often they pause briefly when they talk. Their speech sounds almost herky-jerky to the modern ear. Now, before we continue, herky-jerky kind of means abnormal or unnatural or a little bit stilted, not very flowing. I'm going to continue. The reason their speech sounds somewhat odd in that way is that today people like those on the recording would fill many of those pauses with like. So English, like any language, evolves over time, and what the writer or author here is expressing is that we use filler words instead of pauses. Right now I just made a pause, so instead of saying like or so or but, I just end my sentence, and I take a pause, I take a breath, and I continue. So that's John's point here. It's not as sometimes assumed that people used to talk formally or like books any more than they do now. Casual speech, always and everywhere in any language, is all about short sentences, often unfinished, often with occasional hesitations. But only in the late 1970s did like take its confident perch in American English. The question is why? The answer is not the Frank Zappa's cute 1982 ditty, Valley Girl, featuring his teenage daughter Moon. For one thing, a single song doesn't change the way people talk every day. For another, that song only leads to the question of why Moon was using like that way, given that it wasn't just her quirk, she was part of what we now call a thing. Some people think this usage of like, and I'm guessing he refers to today or in our modern day, reflects some kind of epidemic of uncertainty among young people. But the casual like has now been entrenched long enough that many of its users are graying at the temples, and then some. How unconfident are these near sexagenarians? So, before we continue, the author here is expressing it's not just about young people using like, which is true. I can attest as someone who's younger and uses like on occasion, or or so. But it's also older people, and I think you'll see that if you're in the United States or if you're using American English, people across multiple generations will use like as a filler word. To continue, the modern like is actually a symptom of something more general about how languages change over time. Language, like nature, abhors a vacuum. before we continue, abhors a vacuum means it detests or dislikes a vacuum, or it dislikes that kind of black hole or that absence. So a vacuum is kind of like an absence of, and I use like, there you go. Abhors is like detests or hates. To continue, all languages have a tendency to seep into corners of meaning and get explicit about them, instead of simply leaving them to context. Language likes to get picky. The subjunctive in Romance languages is picky about the hypothetical, for instance. She arrives in Spanish is ella llega. But to say, I hope she arrives, you have to change the ending and say, espero que ella llegue. English largely leaves that nuance of uncertainty to context. Spanish wants it spelled out. A still more extravagant example in the Quayo language of the Solomon Islands, the word for we differs depending on whether you mean yourself and the person you're talking to, or yourself and someone else. There are also different words for we if you're talking about yourself and three people, including whom you are talking to, or three people not including whom you are talking to, or more than three people. Quayo can leave an English speaker with we-ness envy. Before we continue, I like his point here that certain languages, they will have different contexts, different usages for words or different applications. And as he kind of is bringing all together, like in English is no different. Let's continue. English has its hang-ups of this kind too. One is how to express the future, which is much more complex than just using will. I will buy you some socks is, if you think about it, a rather odd thing to say. It sounds a bit like something you concede reluctantly after having resisted. Okay, I will buy you some socks. More typically, we choose from several other options. I'm going to buy you some socks is the more likely vanilla version of the sentence. I'll buy you some socks with a contraction, meaning I'll instead of I will, or I'm, or I'll, or I'm, sounds as though, or I am, I'm instead of I am. Sounds as though you are solving a problem. Tomorrow I buy you some socks sounds festive, like an initiation rite or a quinceañera. By contrast, tomorrow I'm buying you some socks sounds a little like a threat. English is also oddly explicit about, of all things, restraint. We speak with a tacit impulse to keep the drama level moderate, to avoid stridency. One way of doing this is to use the hesitations I referred to in that 1960s recording. You pause before saying something that raises the temperature a bit, reflects an opinion that might arouse, pushes the envelope. But one might also spell out the hesitation more overtly, and this is where the casual like comes in. It quietly implies that what's coming up is like itself rather than just itself, which lowers the temperature. Keeps the burner on medium rather than high. And that's a good point. Before we continue, like is kind of expressing a little bit of hesitation, a little bit of context, a little bit of kind of, sort of, and he dives into this point now. Like as well as sort of, which has become a like for more formal settings, with kind of often filling as a variant of both, variant meaning a type or a variety, I guess, for a lack of a better word, of both is a subtle thing. To learn to use it idiomatically as a foreigner is as tricky as learning how those variations of the English future tense really work. There is even a masterly academic book on the subject, but most of the ways the casual like is used are ultimately variations on that quest for lowering the temperature. Here, for example, is a word-for-word transcription of an American undergraduate speaking casually in the 2020s, recorded for non-linguistic purposes. In writing, it looked shaggy, but in real life, the person sounded perfectly fluent and even intelligent. Now let's read this together. In terms of like figuring out how to do that exactly, like what to look for specifically, especially because like they're, like in the workplace setting, like your job is to follow the guidelines. So like, kind of figuring out how to learn like how the conflicts are playing out. And you see I'm laughing a little bit here, but this is not too far away from how someone would sound. Now, the way it's written here, it sounds terrible. Like you should, and I just use like, but you should never write in this way. Spoken, it's a little bit more informal. The word like is a little bit overused, but you can see how it kind of connects this sentence together, or the kind of the dialogue that this person is having. To continue, the likes in that quote occur not just anywhere, but before something new, something with a bit of impact. The task of figuring something out, the issue that this is a workplace setting rather than your house, the challenge of following new rules, the drama of conflicts. One could certainly express all of this without the use of like and you know and kind of, all filler words here, just to add context. But the result would be a little crisp for casual conversation, perhaps a tad Boy Scout or Leslie Knopish. The temptation is strong to link the emergence of like to something about being American sometime around the Carter administration. We might propose that we are more polite than in the old days, keeping it mellow with like instead of just laying it out directly. But why would that be? The 1970s, after all, were supposedly about the me generation, which presumably would have encouraged a certain boldness in speech. And anything else we might tie to, more weed after the 1960s, would have to explain both why it held on long past that era and why it happened in other Anglophone lands with cultures different from ours. Instead, the casual like is probably just a tick. A tick meaning a tendency, to explain to you watching at home, a tick or a tendency or a capacity or a kind of a habit that develops when we think of tick that happened to catch on, unconnected to anything personal or cultural, like the Romance subjunctive, the quio pronouns, or the future on our own language. After all, French speakers are not professionally hypothetical. Quio speakers have no reason to obsess over precisely who is included in a reference to we. English speakers have no spiritual need for a way of referring to the future with a hint of menace. In other words, the casual like is just business as usual with the evolution of language, including English, I would argue, as he does, the writer as well. And that evolution often confounds. Confounds means confuses or distorts or dilutes or just causes kind of a confusion, a general misunderstanding sometimes. In the 1990s, for example, I asked a man close to 100 years old whether there was anything he noticed about the way young people talked back in the 1920s. His answer, people said, "You know too much." So it's a longer article, but I think it's a very apt article or a important article for those of you learning English as a second language. He talks about the origins of like. He talks about why it might just be a tick that caught on, a tendency that caught on, rather than something personal or cultural. And also, filler words in English go back many decades at least. I'll say as an example, I tend to use you know. Maybe it's the way I grew up, maybe it's my parents or the English that I learned myself, kind of the cultural context or just what people around me said. But I tend to say you know instead of like or so. But it depends on sometimes where you grew up or what you're exposed to in the media or just basically how you learned the language as a kid or from your parents. So I think it's a good article because like is something that we tend to use a lot in American English. We tend to use it as a filler word or say when something is like something else as a comparative word, or it's an important verb like I like you or I like this food or I like the show, etc. So there's many uses for like, but it is kind of a filler word that other languages have. And we're not sure why we use like so much, but it's something that is like any language usage. It develops and evolves and gains popularity. So John McWhorter, if you're interested, he is active in linguistics. He's a professor of linguistics at Columbia University. He's authored a few books, and you could follow him on social media. So overall, I really like this article because it goes over some vocabulary words. It goes over why it became so popular, maybe in the 70s and 80s, how languages tend to get picky with how they address certain verbs or certain manners of speaking, why English we try to not be aggressive or too direct, and we kind of use like as that type of word, sort of, or meaning, or kind of, or it's kind of a word that foreigners or just people who don't speak English as a first language may get at first, but it is an important word to understand the meaning, the context, and the history of it, because it's probably one of our most popular words today. Not just younger people, but older people. So I really hope you enjoyed this article. You can find it on the New York Times. Where did our strange use of like come from? I enjoy doing these longer videos on analyzing English, and I like to do articles, especially with those of you who are intermediate or advanced learners. Thank you very much for watching. Again, my name is Ben with English from A to Z. Please check out our website, www.englishfromatozcom. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it. If you didn't, let me know why. I'm happy to maybe switch it up, but I really like these kind of article readings that I do sometimes. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, English from A to Z, if you enjoyed this video, and I hope to do another Analyzing English video with you all soon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye now. Take care.